Andy, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Are you welcome? Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Well, listen, can we perhaps kick off this conversation here today by you telling listeners a little bit more about your background and how you got into research?
Okay, so I was an absolutely average undergraduate student in sport and exercise science at John Moores a long time ago, between 95 and 98. And then I finished my undergraduate degree and had no idea of what to do next. And then as a result of that, I just kind of happened across... this is going to sound pretty much like I'm dropping names left, right and centre, but I guess it's the reality. I guess it's the reality of where I was and at the time I was there. So Tom Riley obviously had done some work with George Brooks, and George Brooks had come to Liverpool to deliver a symposium, and it had happened in the middle of the summer. It was 1998, it would have been. And I bumped into somebody who was already doing a PhD, and they said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, not very much at the moment." And they said, "Well, they're advertising for some PhD positions. Why don't you go for one?" I didn't have any idea about a research idea. I had no ideas about what to do, but I kind of liked the idea. And to be honest, I had nothing else to do. So it's one of those kind of chance happenings, really, that I was kind of in the right place at the right time. And then I ended up going to this interview, and then later the same day, Tom Riley had offered me a GTA position, so it's a graduate teaching assistant's role, which was to do a part-time PhD alongside with a part-time teaching position and then a teaching qualification at the same time, and then to do kind of make ends meet at the time. I had 2 or 3 other jobs at the same time, so I was pretty busy. And I'll be honest, in the first year or two, I wasn't particularly studious. I have a brilliant letter from my director of studies at the time, Don McLaren, and it says it's an annual report, and it's one line. It says, "No significant progress has been made this year," and that's probably because I played far too much golf. And didn't really do much work.
Nice, get the handicap down.
Yeah, I got the handicap down a bit. But once I got past that bit, I kind of realised that I'd spent far too much time not doing anything, and realised it was probably about time I got on with something. And so I ended up doing a PhD, which looked at multi-sports, so duathlon. We messed about with some environmental temperature stuff, looking at kind of lukewarm temperature, I guess, 10 degrees, 20 degrees and 30-degree environmental temperatures. And then we also messed about with giving people different types of meals prior to doing that type of performance. And I guess one of the things that perhaps we didn't measure too well or didn't really consider at that time was this idea of test-retest reliability. We weren't very good at that at the time. Everyone's become a bit more focused on that to ensure that very, very small performance improvements can be reasonably measured. But I think at the time, those sorts of things were conveniently overlooked, and we had quite a rudimentary understanding or appreciation of what it meant to change someone's performance. I think things have changed considerably since then. And then I did a load of teaching jobs. So I worked at the University of Westminster, which was a great job, but I didn't really like London very much, and I did lots of travelling to get there. Didn't do much research there, just lots of teaching. And then I moved back to the northwest of the UK and worked at the University of Cumbria. Got a little bit of research done there, but not very much. It wasn't really the focus at the time. It certainly is now. They've moved on quite considerably. And I did an awful lot of teaching there. And then I moved to Edge Hill, where I am currently, and I've been there. I'm in my 11th year at Edge Hill. And it's great because it just let me do the research I want. It's convenient because some of my my work colleagues and collaborators are still at John Moores, so it's a fairly convenient location geographically. So
yeah, absolutely, and
very nicely.
Yeah, and if we can circle back to some of that early work you mentioned previously, obviously this was the early days of manipulating diet, low carb, high fat in terms of endurance performance. Can you talk a little bit about what you guys did and what you found back then?
Okay, so we kind of in terms of the diet studies, we kind of moved on. We moved on just looking at the pre-exercise meal. At the time, we kind of developed the work that Helena Whitley had done, and she worked with, actually, on those publications. Keith Frame is on those papers. So he was at the Oxford Metabolism Lab, and he's obviously one of the people that developed the quite widely used stoichiometric equations to calculate fat and carbohydrate oxidation rates from gas analysis data. They got moved on a little bit more and developed a bit further by Ukendrup and Wallace after that, but those are the sorts of equations which are used quite extensively. So we were kind of working from a fairly sound, good quality background, and at the time people were kind of messing about with this idea that if you gave, if you had a reasonable lead in, you could maybe habituate people to kind of high fat or high fat meals. So it was really an attempt to see whether or not there would be that much of a performance change. Helena Whitley's paper from 98, she did a preload at, I think it was 65% VO2 max for an hour and a half, and then she did a 16-kilometre time trial. And she didn't really find much happening. And I kind of wanted to strip out the preload and maybe just do a time trial. We obviously made it a bit more complicated than just doing a cycling or a running time trial. We put in a duathlon performance, which made things a little bit longer and a little bit more awkward to do. But again, we didn't really show much was happening. And with that, just that pre-exercise meal, because the exercise wasn't massively long, we didn't really show. We showed that the oxidation rates were manipulated quite considerably when you give a different fuel, which is fairly obvious, really. If you've got more carbohydrate available, you'll use it preferentially anyway. And we showed those sorts of responses both in blood metabolites and also the hormonal response that you get to that type of exercise, but we didn't find any performance changes at all, even compared to continued overnight fasting and then a 5k run, 30k cycle, and another 5k run. So, we're getting into the realms of where the carbohydrate perhaps should be a little bit more beneficial. If you look at some of the stuff that Javier Gonzalez has done recently, where he's manipulating people's breakfasts and shows that actually that might be quite a beneficial thing to do, not necessarily from a muscle glycogen perspective, but it might be topping up liver glycogen. And so, I think, I'll be honest, I don't know how many people would be this honest, but I'm not sure our performance criteria there was that good. And I think when you get better trained individuals, and also you get single performances rather than those sorts of multi-sport things, I think you can probably drill down into smaller performance changes. But I've got no real plans, I'll be honest, to revisit some of those things. I think if you,
for sure,
the things I'm up to at the moment.
I was going to say, I mean, your interests obviously lie in endurance sport and running and cycling, and so in terms of moving forward from your PhD into your time at Edge Hill, what are some of the things that then, areas of research and things that you guys were looking into? Yeah,
so I'm quite interested in this idea about measurement error across the board, really, not just in terms of performance. I've published a few things on the measurement error of time trial cycling performance, and then but also on kind of measuring anything, really. I think perhaps it's a help, but also a hindrance to be a generalist in a very specialist area. I think you don't get necessarily brilliantly known for being a generalist, because you have your finger in lots of pies all over the place. And if you look at the people who are really eminent in our field, I think they tend to have a real specialism alongside kind of some sub interests. But I'm very much not in that camp. I'm a bit of an exception to the rule, really. I'm interested in perhaps too many things. But one of those things is kind of this idea about measurement error and retest reliability, and that kind of ties in not just kind of looking at things like urine osmometry, which the Graham Close and I did a study on quite a few years ago now. It's not just those sorts of things. It's this idea about can we actually accurately, is that the right word? Perhaps not, but can we definitively measure performance? I think that's quite an interesting thing, because I think it's one of the most difficult things for us to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating, you mentioned the generalism, and obviously you're really a topical area at the moment with David Epstein's new book, Range, and the benefits of...
I've got that on my list to buy for my holiday, I'll be honest.
Yeah, I was going to say,
it's in my wish list.
Your progression through your career sounds quite similar to a lot of the areas that he sort of touches on, and it is quite interesting to look at these, being able to find solutions to problems, and particularly complex problems. And so, that notion of being able to test and retest, and the things that you studied there, obviously being so important to really inform what practitioners are doing, and really be able to say, what is performance. And on that end, in terms of more specific areas around performance, I mean, I know you've done some work with your groups around dietary nitrates and sodium bicarb. What are some of the particularly around endurance performance? So can you talk a little bit about the work in dietary nitrates recently?
Yeah, so we originally one of our undergraduate students actually came up with a great idea, which was to do dietary nitrate ingestion prior to resistance exercise performance. We published that a while ago. So that was Scott Mosher's first publication. And we showed that if you took 3 days worth of nitrate prior to doing resistance exercise, 3 sets to failure at 65% 1RM, that you can improve the number of reps, and the total amount of weight lifted. So that's quite an interesting kind of acute response and an acute observation. Scott became interested in dietary nitrate across the board, I think inspired by Andy Jones's group, really, because they're kind of they're the guys that are doing everything on this.
Yep.
You have to look at Andy Jones to realise he's quite into Beetroot, but Scott then stayed on and did a master's with us, and I think maybe my interest in cycling had rubbed off a little bit, and he decided that he was quite interested in this idea of taking a performance criteria which is ecologically valid. And I think that's probably some of the other issues that we've got. So you have this idea about measurement, error and performance, and familiarization of athletes or your participants with a measurement criteria, but it still needs to be real world applicable. And I think often we choose these criteria, perhaps not for the right reasons. And I think sometimes one of the best ways to get to kind of make sure that your participants are able to kind of replicate their performance is to just choose a performance, one which is ecologically valid, but ties in also with the question that you're trying to answer. The ecological validity means that they're probably more likely to be familiarized with it. So we have used extensively 16.1 kilometre time trials. They're called 10 milers in the UK, and it's like the standard club distance that everyone rides week in, week out. And the reason for that is we can get people to replicate that performance time and time again because they're doing it really, really regularly. So Scott's work really was to kind of take a bout of exercise which might last, around an hour and a quarter. Certainly, we would hope under an hour and a quarter, maybe just over an hour and 5, hour and 8 minutes, something like that for a reasonable club level athlete. Which we're in a small market town, but there's an awful lot of cyclists in the northwest knocking around. So
nice.
we've got a really good pool of athletes that we can call upon, which is quite nice. So Scott was interested in that. He'd seen a couple of studies which had looked at longer distance. So Wilkerson had published a paper a couple of years before looking at 80 kilometre time trials. That's 50 miles, and shown that there was no real difference in performance. So he wanted to do a kind of shorter distance version of that. And if you look in that paper, we've plotted the individual responses. And alongside the mean data. I think lots of studies just do mean data. I quite like the idea of showing what actually is going on with each individual.
Absolutely.
And when you've got look at those individual responses in that paper, they're all over the place. So even though we've got people who are really familiar with the distance, and even though we've done a control, a placebo, and dietary nitrate, and there's no trial order effect, we still can't get people to all the time replicate what's going on. I think the other thing with nitrate, I suppose, partly is that if you've got a group of people who really look after themselves, then the chances are that their baseline nitrate might be reasonably high anyway.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, in that study, we weren't able to measure that prior to or in response to our supplementation. So I think that's, again, probably one of those sorts of limitations that might be potentially problematic. On the one hand, you want really well-trained people who are familiarised and therefore able to replicate their performance time and time again. But then you've also got this idea that it's going to be more difficult within that group to show a performance difference because they're well adapted anyway. But then the thing with nitrate, I suppose, is if they've got a diet which is full of leafy vegetables and beets, then you'll probably not have a great effect anyway. Certainly in that distance, I don't think that, I wouldn't be rushing to, if I got a reasonably balanced diet, I wouldn't be rushing to advise people that would be the thing to do for a 40-kilometre time trial.
And Andy, for folks listening in, what was the dose there for the endurance in terms of the amount of nitrates?
It's 6
roughly.
Let me just find out. I can't remember. And that's the other thing, I guess, is part of the issue when you've got this eclectic mix of things is you're not reading the same stuff over and over and over again. So it's quite difficult, actually, I'll be honest, to remember everything I've done. So it's quite tricky. So we gave a dose of 12.8 millimoles. So, so 6.4 split across the day twice for 3 days.
Interesting. And is that, in terms of the magnitude of the differences you saw with the individuals, is there a way to flush out in terms of, how the athletes responded in terms of their subjective experience to taking it, or was it really just a matter of looking at the data to see who actually got the benefit from taking the beetroot?
Yeah, I think that's one of the benefits of potentially looking at individual responses, because particularly in nutrition, because some people will respond well to things and others won't. And so, if it works for one person, even if it's almost a placebo effect, then, the placebo effect's called an effect for a reason, in that it might have some value. So, I think the kind of the important thing here really is, if you were to try this, would be have a go at taking it in practice. And I think often people will take these things prior to a competition without actually trying it.
For sure. In
practice. And so the thing to do is obviously have a go and see if it makes you feel better when you do it, and is your performance time improved. Well, if you said to a club athlete, if you take this for 3 days beforehand, you'll knock 6 seconds off your PB, they'll probably, they'll be delighted with that. But the reality is, does that mean that we have the ability to measure that as a meaningful difference in performance? I think they're two different questions, really.
Yeah, and
go on. Sorry,
I was going to say, you touched on something there around just the quality of the diet of the athlete, and it's something that I've noticed anecdotally in clients in terms of athletes who are on more of a processed food diet, for lack of a better term. A lot of basketball players or football players, often the younger ones, or their diets aren't exactly super compelling in terms of what they're having in terms of variety and quality, and those athletes seem to be getting a better potential benefit from the dietary nitrates. Is that something that could be a potential benefit if we have athletes or practitioners have athletes who are don't have a very diverse diet, who are not eating all the leafy greens, that theoretically maybe there could be a potential bigger benefit for those individuals?
I think you're right. I think that there's more room for potential improvement, because they're starting off at a more disadvantaged baseline position. And I guess that's partly some of the issues there are, us as researchers, we don't always have the resources to measure everything that we'd like.
Oh, for sure.
So sometimes you have to kind of read between the lines.
Absolutely.
But if you look at kind of diet quality, certainly in those younger athletes, sometimes it's the athletes that live at home as well. So you see this in footballers in particular in Europe, where they have like an academy system. But even in an academy system, you might well only be able to control 2 out of possibly 2, maybe even only 1 of those meals that they have a day, even if they're in a full-time academy. So if you can only control 1 meal, then your issue is that of education of the player. But then also, if it's quite a young player, they're going to be supplied with their food by usually their home situation. So maybe the mum or whoever is putting meals on the table.
For sure.
And so it's not just about educating the player, is it? It's about educating the people providing the food for the player. Sometimes there are obviously major cultural differences as well. So depending on what the environment and the geographical location, that might have a massive impact on the quality of what food people are actually consuming, even when they know they shouldn't be consuming various things. If it's presented to them at regular times, then they're probably going to eat it anyway.
Yeah, that's absolutely. And you can even go a step further with, if the parents have a certain condition in their background, then they're more or less likely to eat certain foods. And yeah, it is amazing how environment is such a huge factor in this. And it's obviously not very easily controlled, is it?
No. I think really the only way to kind of resolve these sorts of issues, sometimes experimentally. I mean, your ideal recruit for these sorts of studies is military recruits, because they're in such a controlled environment. You can quantify quite easily exactly the activities they're doing, and you can very, very closely monitor their nutritional intakes. But in free living individuals, it's very, very difficult. So really, it's almost lesson 1 in sports nutrition. It's how do we measure these things, and also why is body composition such a vital tool for us to ensure that energy balance is appropriate in the long term. I think if you look at loads of data, especially in football, soccer, I guess. If you look at
North American listeners appreciate that.
Yeah. So if you look at it in that sort of an environment, and you get things like fixture congestion, for instance, or you look at things like the Tour de France, there's going to be periods where the expenditure is far outweighing intake. But from a health perspective, our issue is not those kind of acute responses. It's the long-term change, and ensuring that in the long term you kind of have balance, and making sure that in the short term you kind of acknowledge that there's probably going to be some periods where they are in that sort of energy deficit.
Yeah, I mean, and particularly in terms of endurance sport, I mean, it's obviously so important in terms of the power to weight ratios and et cetera. So, if we continue down this line of talking about, the marginal gains around potential supplements, I mean, I know you've done some work around sodium bicarbonate, which is another tried and tested supplement that's shown benefit in endurance. And, recent conversations I had with Prof. Stu Phillips around the IOC's recent position stand there around supplements for performance. Obviously, sodium bicarb included in the list yet again. And you looked at a novel ingestion strategy, or your group, a delayed release form of sodium bicarb. Can you tell listeners a little bit more about why the delayed release form and what you found in the crossover study? Yeah,
it's from a research interest perspective. It's one of those chance happenings. So I was at Edge Hill for about 3 or 4 years, and then Lars McNaughton turned up. So he became one of my colleagues, and obviously he was one of the people to really champion this as a performance supplement way back in the mid 80s. And he often says to me, if you'd have told me that that 20 years ago that I'd still be doing this in nearly 2020, he said, I would have just laughed at you. But there's so many other studies that we have both planned and also that we are currently trying to trawl through. I think, if I remember back to my undergraduate days, because at the time, one of my lecturers at uni was Don McLaren, and he had done some stuff on bicarb and sodium citrate, and so I was kind of drip fed some of this information really early on. I never thought I would revisit it, but it's really interesting, because we find that using this technique of personalizing the dose, what we've developed is this method of initially giving a dose of bicarb and then working out individualized times to peak alkalinity, so that instead of just giving a dose to somebody and going, well, we'll give it at about 65 minutes or 90 minutes or 180 minutes, depending on the delivery method, we have worked out that actually the variability between individuals is vast. So the shortest time to peak we've measured is 10 minutes.
Wow.
That might be an outlier.
Yeah. Pretty impressive.
It might be an outlier. That's only happened once, but we have had people repeatedly at 20 and 15 minutes.
Okay.
So if they're then taking this supplement 90 minutes before they do their performance, there's a good chance they'll be missing when it's going to have its peak effect by quite a considerable margin. But to be fair, though, that is one of the things we're not sure about, is how long can you leave it. So that's something that we're currently working on. So what's the window of peak ergogenicity? That's what we're interested in.
And is there a guesstimate, Andy, in terms of what it might be then at the moment? Or
well, what's really interesting is that if you cobble together everyone's data, they typically, depending on how you give it to them, so if it's a solution, it typically will cause alkalinity much more quickly than if you give it in a gelatin capsule. And if you give it in delayed release caps, then the time to peak changes quite considerably. So we've done quite a number of these sorts of experiments. We have another paper under review. I won't spoil what that's going to be like, because I get into trouble for ruining the peer review.
Yeah, no worries.
So,
leave listeners on the edge of their seats. This is good.
Yeah, but but I think one of the key things that we're really interested in is going back to the original kind of caveat of, oh well, it might make you do your performance, whatever the performance criteria is. It might make you quicker at doing it or more powerful or whatever it is, but you'll have some very nasty side effects.
Yeah,
and everyone knows what that is. You know, everyone in our field, most athletes of any sort of high intensity, medium sort of middle distance type performance durations, they all know the potential hazards of taking bicarb. And so what we're really after and what we're trying to champion is that if you've got kind of a 10 out of 10 rating for the severity of your gastrointestinal upset, irrespective of how you deliver bicarb, it's probably not for you.
Yeah, very well said.
It's not going to, because it's going to end up being ergolytic. So we published a paper not so long ago where we gave people 0.3 milligrams per kilo of bicarb. 0.3 grams per kilo of bicarb, and then we made them do a 3-minute all-out test at altitude. Well, simulated hypoxia anyway, which was very unpleasant as a participant. I'll be honest, because I was one of them, and I'm the participant who is extremely hampered by taking bicarbonate or sodium bicarb. I cannot get on with it at all.
Oh no.
And so when you look at the data of the individual responses, I am the person whose performance goes in the opposite direction in that paper. I probably shouldn't identify participants, but I'm quite happy to. In that
Identify yourself. There you go.
But when you deliver it in different formats, so one of our rationales really for that study was to try and limit the GI. Because if we can limit the GI, then we can open this up as a potential ergogenic to a far wider audience, and that's essentially what we've seen with, you know, when you give these sorts of delayed release capsules, the idea is that it bypasses the stomach, and most of the bicarb is then released into the intestine rather than the stomach. So when it enters the stomach, you get CO2 production when it reacts with the stomach acid, and so what happens then is you just get bloating and you feel awful. And in cases, we know exactly what's going to happen there. But if you can bypass the stomach, then you don't feel as bad, and you still get the same amount of bicarb essentially being delivered. Arguably, you might even get more delivered when it's tipped. Essentially, it's like a gastric bypass, if you want to use that expression.
Yeah, there you go. Right.
Brian Saunders' group in Sao Paulo have used that phrase in one of the studies they published, I think the year before last, where they tried to essentially do that and showed reductions in GI responses. So, you know, we've been trying to use these sorts of responses and compared them to when you give it just as a solution. When you give it as a solution as well, it tastes horrendous. So, you know, there's no type of fruit juice that will gloss over the fact that it feels like you're drinking the ocean.
It's hard to hide it, right?
It's very difficult. We often, when we do those things, we'll sodium match them for taste, so that when we give a control, we're at least giving sodium so it tastes similar, which in itself, obviously, potentially, in some instances, can be ergogenic. But when we look down the list of kind of the severities of GI responses, you know, when we give the delayed release capsule form, admittedly, people are taking maybe 25, 35 capsules in one go, which again puts some people off, depending on their weight, because it's all done relative to body mass.
Yeah.
You might go from a 10 to maybe a 5 out of 10 in some instances, or in some instances, people are going from 10 out of 10 with severe diarrhea to no diarrhea, a bit of belching, and a 3 out of 10 on our GIS scale. So then all of a sudden, there's the possibility of people opening their eyes to this again and revisiting it as a potential ergogenic aid. What's interesting as well, I've got some anecdotal evidence to suggest that in pro cycling, they're actually using this for any time trials that are up to an hour.
Interesting.
Which is really interesting, because most of the studies say that actually when you go past, you know, sort of half an hour, you're probably not going to show any difference. And again, that might well be because we're refining our performance criteria a bit, we're controlling experiments better, and also it makes sense, you know, when you look at riders who do time trials, you know, even when you do an hour, there's a good chance your blood lactate concentrations are going to be 10, 12, 15 at the end, because in that last quartile of it, you're going to be absolutely flying if you've got anything left. So in that instance, you know, it makes sense that bicarb may well have a role to play if there's enough left, and that's the other issue, you know. If the exercise is too long, you might well have used most of it.
Absolutely. And Andy, for those who aren't as familiar in terms of a performance benefit, you know, what kind of percentage are we talking about here in elite, and then maybe just in recreational, if there's a difference there?
Yeah, I mean, it very much depends on the performance type, and it depends on the athlete type as well. But, you know, we're talking potentially 3-4% potentially in a 4K time trial in a well-trained individual, which is fairly substantial.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's definitely one of those things, as you mentioned, if you can get the GI issues reduced, especially by 50% or more, I mean, it does become a lot more compelling, doesn't it?
It does, because that's the instant thing that's going to put everybody off. The only problem we've got is that delivering it in these sorts of capsules is at the moment quite expensive to do. So some of the capsules, depending on the coating on them, can be between, you know, €1 and €2.50 each. So if you're a fairly heavy track rider, for instance, and you're maybe 75, 80, 90 kilos, and you're taking a fairly substantial dose, you might be taking 25 to maybe 35 or maybe even 40 of these capsules, and if they're going to cost you €2 each, it doesn't become a practical or feasible method. So that's again some of the things that we're trying to work on, is how can we use this principle to deliver this, but also reduce some of the GI, but it not cost an absolute fortune to do it. Now, that might be all right for Team Ineos who've got a few quid.
Yeah, exactly.
But the reality is, for the people that this can have the most impact on, the club rider doing a 10-miler, I do get people ask me all the time who are riding these events, can we have some of these capsules, or can we have some of, can we get access to kind of the time to peak so we can know what time to take it before our time trial, all this sort of stuff. And I think that's part of the other thing is, if you look back at some of the meta-analyses, and Amelia Carr did a meta-analysis 2011, I think it was, looking at the overall effectiveness of bicarb as an ergogenic aid, and it doesn't say that it's actually that ergogenic, and in some studies it's not ergogenic at all. Mm-hmm. So again, we come back to that individual variability a bit, but then we also come back to the fact that if everyone's giving a standardized time dose and not using the individualized time to peak, then in some of those individuals that window might well have been missed. So we haven't published much at the moment in terms of the effect of that individualization on performance. So Lewis Goff has published a few things on 4-kilometer time trial. Sanjoy Deb has published a few bits and pieces on really intense, high intensity exercise with some hypoxic environment stuff as well. And in our lab, we typically see that the performance improvements using the strategy are a bit higher than we might normally expect, and certainly that are higher than are published in the literature.
And Andy, how far off might we be then for somebody to actually have this test performed on them in terms of a recreational athlete? Is that still quite a ways down the road in terms of getting into a lab and doing this, or is there might there be a way soon of being able to nail down that personalized dose?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because we're back to that idea that when you're if you're a really super keen recreational athlete, that you're willing to pay a consultant fee to the local university to do a VO2 max or a lactate threshold, and we're in the same realms. And the issue is that at present you either need an iStat, which we know that some of the cycling teams are using to measure this, or you need a radiometer, and the radiometers are not cheap, and neither are the consumables. So it becomes quite, again, inhibitively expensive to tailor make this to happen at exactly the right time for each individual. So that's one of the other areas that we're trying to explore, which is how do we make this commercially available at a very low price, or even can we make this so that people can test this themselves?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So that's a fascinating question for sure. I mean, it's especially in something that's definitely does work, and we know it works. It's just a matter of that tolerability and getting folks to use it. And if we shift gears here a little bit, Andy, to some of the work that you've done in ultra endurance athletes, so longer bouts here, and shifting over from supplementation to that food first approach there, the fueling practices in ultra endurance athletes. And I believe your group looked at over about 100 participants. So can you tell us a bit about what the impetus was for this work, and what were some of the key findings?
Okay, so this was, again, another one of my PhD students, Claire, was Lindsay, now Blenna Hassett. So she was interested, she's an ultra runner, and so she was interested in kind of trying to work out whether or not people were able to understand really what the requirements were from a nutrition perspective. Did they really understand what it was that they needed to do from a nutrition strategy perspective to fuel properly, recover from, and so she set about trying to kind of come up with a couple of adapted questionnaires and validate those questionnaires in order to do that. So we took a pre-existing questionnaire and adapted it and validated it in this in this population. One of the things that's actually hidden in one of those papers, which is quite interesting, was that we assessed sports nutrition knowledge, and what we found was that the ultra endurance athletes' knowledge was slightly better than registered dietitians.
Wow!
And we haven't publicised that too much because we probably upset some registered dietitians, but that was the reality, that we compared the dietitians also to SENA registered individuals. So have you heard of the SENA registration?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so we recruited a few of those people to kind of fill in our questionnaire and see what their knowledge was like in this context, and their knowledge was better than the dietitians as well, which is quite interesting.
Absolutely.
I would it's quite a good thing. I think it makes sense as well that's the case. But actually, some of the knowledge from the athletes themselves is quite interesting. And these studies come at a time where the high fat agenda, if you want to call it that, anybody that engages with Twitter at all will be more than aware.
Yeah, it's a polarized world out there, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's far too many people who can't see the other side of the argument, and I think
all the grey in between, right?
Well, it's all grey, really.
Exactly.
It's all slightly different shades of grey.
Yeah.
I think that it kind of makes me laugh at times. I think most people take these things completely out of context, and no one size fits all. I tell my undergraduate students that in nutrition, one size fits one.
Nice, I like that.
It doesn't fit everyone, and unfortunately, when you work with a either a recreational or a general population from a health perspective, they want this, magic, extremely simple to understand solution to all of their nutritional and biochemical ills. And the reality is that we know that that's not going to happen without quite a bit of effort. Because we can give this kind of very generic information for people when the physical and metabolic state of each of them, and what their habitual activities are like, when they're so varied, you just can't give out this information, as far as I can see, as a one size fits all. It just doesn't work, and I think you only have to look at the general population in terms of amount of physical activity they do, the type of quality of their diets, and also the sheer level of non-communicable diseases in developed countries. I think we've got that kind of one size fits all very, very wrong, because nobody follows any of the guidance. Anyway,
yeah,
got off topic slightly.
No, for sure. Yeah, and back, circling back to the ultra endurance, was there any trends there that you guys picked up on in terms of the fueling practices?
Yeah, so quite a number of them know what they're doing, and I think we've done a couple of studies which, again, we're in the process of going through. Oddly enough, tomorrow I'm doing some bloods on some of this stuff from some of these studies that we've done. I guess that the kind of some of the issues are that some of these athletes at the time we did these questionnaires, some of them were following vegetarian and vegan, which is fine from an ethical, moral perspective. There's no issues there, so long as you know what you're doing.
Yep.
There's quite a number of them who were paleo and or high fat. I'll be naughty and put those two together, because for me they're not high carbohydrate, or they don't have a particular preference. Yeah. So we found over 20% of people at the time were in that camp. And I think, anecdotally, I think there's quite a number of ultra endurance athletes who are messing with high fat and very, very low carbohydrate diets. And that's fine, so long as, one, it works for them, two, they've measured themselves accurately against when they're on a high carb diet. And I don't think anybody really does that, because they just go, well, I've lost a load of fat mass and I feel better, so therefore I must be better on this high fat, low carb diet. Mm-hmm. Which is fine if they had some timber to lose in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. For
sure. If you're starting from a very lean perspective, it's probably not going to help you too much. And also, if you're exercising for 24 hours at 50% of max, then that's very different to if you're working for 6 or 8 hours and you're working at 75% max. The two things are not the same. I think we come back to that oversimplification of, well, this diet works for me. Well, it might do, but it just very much depends on the actual nature and intensity and the duration of the activity.
Yeah, the context is so key, right?
Yeah, and with ultras as well, defining what ultra endurance exercise is quite a difficult thing to do, because everyone's got their own interpretation of what that is. And so when you look at we did a study not too long ago with Jamie Pugh looking at probiotics and marathon performance. So if you take marathon as the kind of minimum distance and anything over that is ultra endurance, well, that's one definition, isn't it? An ultra endurance event is anything bigger than a marathon. Okay, that's fine. Yeah. But then there's other people that will say anything over 4 hours. Well, that's definitely ultra endurance. But how many people do a marathon recreation?
Yeah, it would all be ultras for most recreational runners.
Yeah, so at the polar ends of even marathon performance, you've got some people who are in the low 2 hours, and then you've got people who are at 6 hours. Well, the demands there are massively different from a time perspective, but ultimately those people who are in 6 hours are actually, arguably, they might actually be doing ultra endurance exercise. So, because of the sheer length of time that they're active.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the distance that they're covering. And so the fueling needs are obviously completely different.
Definitely. I mean, I'm always amazed at how some of the elite coaches as well, obviously don't have their runners run for longer than 2.5, 3 hours for any of these events. And as you mentioned, recreational marathoners are doing, lots of training sessions over that time. So it really is a totally different, almost is more like ultra marathoning for a lot of these folks.
That's it. Yeah, very much so. I think, if you kind of look at some of the data, which is, I think it was Andy Jones at a conference. I saw a sneaky little snippet of a slide and it was about Eliud Kipchoge's preparation prior to breaking 2.
Yeah.
And obviously he's running exceptionally fast, but he's not actually exercising for all that long in his preparation for that. If you look at the data that Andy Jones has previously kind of shown various people, so you might have one long runner in the weeks, in some of those weeks, but the reality is that measuring distance is probably not that. Not measuring distance, but looking at the time duration is probably a bit more important for a runner who's going really, really quick.
Yeah, for sure.
Because the demands for a slower runner, even though they're covering, similar sort of distance, is very different.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. And Andy, if we zoom back out, you mentioned being more of a generalist in this sort of specialist world. And before the interview here, we talked a little bit about some of the challenges of assessing performance in a research setting, in a lab setting. Could you talk about a few things, challenges that come up when you're running studies with recreational athletes, elite athletes, and some of the things that you're trying to control for?
Yeah, so I think everyone has this kind of perfect idea of how they're going to run their study and exactly what they want their participants to do. And I think that part of our issue as a field really is to measure performance well, and that's a very difficult thing to do very well. And we go back to this term free living participants. Mm-hmm. So in this environment where you can't control everything because people aren't supervised all of the time prior to when they come to the lab, we have to make these sorts of assumptions that they're going to follow the things that we want them to do. And the odd time where you kind of look at some of the data and you go, I'm not convinced that they've actually listened to me this time round, you can then obviously say, okay, well, how come you were so much worse this time round once they've finished all their trials? Because you don't want to give any of the performance data away until they've done everything. Mm-hmm. And at that point, sometimes they'll say, oh, well, that week I decided that I would have a bit of a run the day before and I was a bit tired still. And whilst people might like follow the instructions, and they'll be in the informed consent information, and you'll have briefed them prior to it, and you reinforce that on every visit. The reality is that you have to kind of take people at their word that they're going to do that. So that can kind of put a bit of a fly in the ointment for our ability to kind of look at what is often very small performance improvements, and it's quite tricky to measure those things. The other thing is that often we make this assumption that people are fully familiarised with trials, and I'm guilty of it myself in some of my earlier papers, certainly, where we say the participant was familiarised. What we mean in that instance is that they did one trial prior to when you then started measuring their performance. Now you can get around that slightly because you can get really well-trained individuals doing a protocol which is entirely what they're used to doing, and entirely ecologically valid, which is why we typically go for, in a cycling context, 4-kilometre time trial, because track riders do that all the time. We go for 16-kilometre time trial, 16.1, it's 10 miles, because it's the most popular distance in the UK, certainly, for a club rider to do a time trial on. Or we do 25 miles or 40 kilometres, because they're also used to doing those. We've got quite a few people knocking around the place who also do 100-milers and things, but that's a completely different kettle of fish that you can't get enough people to do those sorts of distances. And again, the retest reliability of those sometimes is so great that it's difficult to spot small differences. So that's really our challenge, is to try and really familiarise people, use ecologically valid tests as much as possible, try and at least interpret the data that we get within what we know about the retest reliability of that test. And sometimes people don't do that either. And I've seen that, working with people many years ago in elite football. So you get people who say, okay, well, in pre-season we use the 50, 30, 20 meter shuttle test to look at sprint performance in our footballers, and of course the first week back after pre-season, they don't try very hard, and then a week before the season starts, miraculously
effort's going up pretty good
on the second one. So that's another issue, I guess. And then the other thing, I suppose, is in that sort of a regard is that you've got to try and kind of really brief people properly. I've seen a few. We've withdrawn people quite consistently from trials where they don't fully understand. This doesn't happen with really well-trained people, but active individuals. If you're using them, they really don't, in the first few trials, understand what eyeballs out
really means.
As fast as you possibly can do it means. And I guess that comes back to this idea of familiarization, but also it comes back to that idea of them having that pacing schema. They know how they're going to pace themselves before they start. They know what it feels like. They know what at each of those sorts of mental time points or distances during the trial, what they should feel like, what they're able to put up with. And I think that's all part of that idea of making sure that you've got people who are really able to replicate that performance. And I think we're definitely getting better at it. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely.
Again, the other thing you've got to consider is how long is the start of my first trial, and how many weeks is it till I can get everyone through each of the trials. And we know that there's going to be some performance replication drift in terms of the CVs of these things between week 1 to week 2 to week 3 to week 4, unless they're regularly doing them. So if you've got like a 4-week long ingestion period on a trial, then you're going to have worse retest reliability if there's 4 weeks between the trials than you will if they're doing it 1 week apart. Mm-hmm. And I think we often have to kind of take a step back when we interpret some of these data and say, yeah, but we need to really use the stats as a tool to kind of interpret the data, but then work out whether or not it's actually a meaningful change with respect to the retest reliability. And I don't think not enough people do that. I think we should all be doing it. And certainly from a practitioner's perspective, that's exactly what we should be doing. So going back to our footballers who are doing their 20-metre trial, they improved by 0.01 of a second, and you know, the sports science intern goes, "Oh, you've got better." But have you really? Probably not, because the error associated with the test is so large that you have to really work out whether or not you're doing a test which is useful in the first place, but also can we make a meaningful inference from the result that we've got in respect to the retest reliability.
I mean, that's a great insight, and it dovetails into my last question for you here, which is effectively, with your diverse background, looking at team sports, you know, which is an area that I focus on, whether it's football, basketball, you know, rugby, whatever it might be. Obviously that retest is a hugely important area. And as you mentioned, are you asking the right question? When you look across some of these sports, you know, what are some things that jump out to you as areas that could be, that still need to be examined, or where there's, you know, still marginal gains to be had?
I think bottom line, we probably, too many people take too many supplements when most of them probably don't work.
Nice.
And also the vast majority of them you probably don't need to take, so long as you get your nutrition right in the first place. So I think education is a really important factor, particularly with the young athlete, especially if they're living
Absolutely.
at home. It's not just about what the team tells the athlete to do. The athlete also needs to understand why they're doing that. They need to work in usable, friendly units and portion sizes, not percentages of anything. All bespoke grams per kilo units, much more sensible, much easier to follow. And then also, you know, if they're a fairly young athlete, well, if you look at the UK now, unless you're a very well-paid athlete, you're probably going to be living at home for quite a considerable length of time. So if that happens, and your food is being provided by, you know, your home unit, your home environment, then some education about what types of food you need and when you need it to the person providing you with the food, if you're not cooking yourself, that's also really important. And I think that's something that probably they've started to look at, certainly in academy systems in football, but probably only at the elite end. And if you look at the total number of people who are in the lower leagues and are in those sorts of systems, you know, my son's 7, and some of his mates are in the academy system already, 7 and 8 year olds, which is for me a little extreme. But
yeah, for sure.
And then, you know, and you've got that sort of situation where they're expecting players even at that age to perform well, but the kids obviously anybody with kids will realise it's quite tricky when I work in this sort of field. It's quite embarrassing when you go out for a meal with kids, because no matter what you do or what your background is, you still can't get them to eat the things you want them to eat.
Especially if they're your kids. Exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you just think, oh no, I hope no one sees me. But the reality is, you know, that the kids are probably not eating the things they should. We know that from some of the survey work with footballers and team sports that there's a high chance that a good proportion of them underreport. That might well have an impact on our interpretation of that data. But we also know that quite a number of them don't hit the targets for carbs, for instance. They don't hit the targets for energy intake compared to their energy expenditure. They often in team sports will hit the protein requirements, but at the expense of all the other things. Mm-hmm. I think probably should, because and again, that probably comes down to kind of 20 years of sports nutrition marketing that protein shakes are the best thing to do.
There you go.
And well, they might be convenient, but why aren't you eating real food in order to hit those targets? Absolutely,
yeah, very well said. And Andy, definitely appreciate you carving out some time here today, sharing your insights. Really fascinating. And where can people stay connected with you and keep up with all your tremendous research?
So the Edge Hill website has got my face for radio on it.
Nice.
And also I've got a Twitter feed which is Sparks_Andy. So I'll you might be able to put up with the things I tweet about. There's far too much pro cycling on there though. So if you If you
Tremendous.
can put up with that, if you can put up with that, please don't tell me what happened in the tour today because I've not seen the highlights yet.
No worries.
Let's go and watch them.
Fantastic. Well, listen, Andy, thanks so much again for carving out the time, and yeah, I really appreciate all the research and insights you provided.